Over the next few minutes, I'm going to be talking about one particular element in our module, Spirituality and Discipleship. It is really a very important element, but if I say a bit about the module itself to start with, you'll understand perhaps a little bit more clearly about why it's such an important element. Spirituality and Discipleship is an introductory module. And partly by introductory, I mean that it asks some of the very basic, very fundamental questions, like what do we mean when we say something is spiritual? What is spirituality? What is the meaning of the word spirit within that little word spirituality? In addition, we'll be asking questions about human beings, about the sorts of creatures they are, about the strangeness of being creatures who also in their lives confront not just the myriad relationships around them, but also are called to a relationship with God. Creatures, therefore, who pray, who worship, who even offer their lives with all their joys and pains, frailties and possibilities, offer their whole lives to God. So what sort of creatures are we? In order to help students explore these very basic questions, we've, in this module, set up a conversation between some of the most familiar elements of Christian spirituality, topics such as prayer, topics such as Holy Spirit, and some of the more well-known teachers in the Christian tradition, people like Augustine and Julian of Norwich and so on. We've set up a conversation between them and contemporary science. Partly this is in order to increase or help confidence in bringing our theology and thinking our spiritual practice within a cultural context in which the sciences have such huge authority. We want to help students think openly and listen openly to some of the things the sciences say about what it means to be alive, what it means to be a human being in relation with other life on this planet. And in particular, one of the threads that bind this module together is captured in the term embodiment. For far too long, Christians have had a tendency, along with a lot of the Western world, Western culture, to think of ourselves all too much like brains on sticks, as if we were first and foremost minds driving fleshly thing called a body. That's a very unsatisfactory, in certain ways, very dangerous way of thinking about ourselves. So in this module, we're trying to push ourselves a bit to think about ourselves as embodied, or perhaps better, as minded bodies, to get us feeling comfortable with the idea that we are our bodies. We don't just have bodies. And there again, in this context, science can offer us some help as we listen to some of the things that science is saying about bodily life, about the neurology of our bodies, about the conditions for their flourishing, and about death and life. Now, this is where the particular element comes in. It is perverse, I think, to teach Christian spirituality without including an opportunity to do Christian spirituality. It would be to have a module that had no practice in it would be akin to learning to swim without actually ever going near the water. So, an important part of the module is what you are going to do in terms of spiritual practices. We are going to ask you to choose 4 spiritual practices from a pretty long list of possible choices. And over the weeks, a little bit before and then to about 2/3 through the course, to exercise, to experiment with these practices. As you experiment, you'll ask questions such as, what is the purpose of this practice? What am I getting out of it? How might this affect change in my life? What about this practice is, or perhaps will, draw me closer to the presence of God? There are lots of choices, as I say, and we've divided them into 4 categories. The idea is that you'll choose one practice from each category. And here are the categories. The first category is Ecclesial, which is a fancy way of saying all these practices have something to do with church. All 4 categories, as you'll see, involve relationships, although the sphere and kind of relationships change from category to category. So the first is the set of relationships around church. The second category we've called personal and cultural. And this has to do with the relationships of daily life. It has to do with close, intimate relationships, such as with family and with friends. But it also has to do with relationships that are broader with our larger culture. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. The third category is the one perhaps that is most familiar among our thoughts of Christian spirituality. It has to do with prayer. We've called it mystical, but it has to do, as I say, with prayer, with reading scripture, with practices such as Lectio Divina, practices such as walking a labyrinth. Finally, we've got a slightly oddly named category, which we've called the world of which we are. And essentially that means our relationships with non-human life, with the world of which we are part, which we sometimes refer to rather, not altogether happily, as our environment. So those are your 4 categories. And it's going to be very important as you choose which spiritual practices you're going to undertake to be kind to yourself. Some of these practices could take a great deal of your time. So you wouldn't want to choose 4 of them because you probably wouldn't, if you took them seriously, have much left by way of time and energy to do anything else. So it's probably best to choose one that is reasonably demanding, depending on the circumstances of your life, and then choose 3 others that are not quite so demanding. Let me give you some examples, though. Under Ecclesial, we have a number of practices that expand the circle of relationships with respect to the church. So we suggest, for instance, as one practice, that you would, once a month, you would participate in an act of Christian worship that's significantly different from the that of the community of faith, the church, in which you regularly worship. Another related suggestion to that is that you worship once a month in an ethnic community different from your own. Then others are such practices as joining a home group or a Bible study, or leading a Bible study, or organising a charitable event or a fundraising project to meet the needs of a group that's connected with your church community. Under personal and cultural, we've got a variety, and again, some of these can be quite demanding, but some of them will be something you could do for a few minutes every morning, for instance. Some of these, what's worth saying at this point, some of these practices may strike you as not particularly Christian and not particularly spiritual. Our hope, though, is that by the end of this module, you'll understand why indeed they can be, indeed perhaps should be, spiritual and Christian spiritual practices. For instance, under personal and cultural, we have adopt vegetarianism or veganism for a week, or perhaps for a month, if your family can stand it. Take up an exercise plan, or incorporate a new form of physical exercise into your existing practice. We also suggest that you might spend a day focusing on your sense of touch and make some notes, some reflections about the thoughts that came to you as you explored that fundamental but often perhaps rather undiscussed sense. In addition, we have things that like walk to work for a change, and more challenging things like forgive and make amends to somebody with whom you've fallen out, with someone with whom you've had a significant disagreement or conflict. We've suggested too that you might adopt a pattern of family prayers or tell your children stories from the Bible. In the past, we've found that one of the most challenging of these practices really requires you to do not much at all, which is simply to turn off your television for a week. Some people have found that very difficult to start with, but as one lady said to me, on the second day I realised that actually my husband was quite fun to talk to. Well, they'd spend an awful lot of time together, sitting, watching, not each other, but the television. And it appears she had slightly forgotten just how enjoyable it could be to sit and have a relaxing conversation with her husband. Under the more cultural ones, we've suggested that you do something in the field of cultural activity that you might not have done before, or you might actually not like very much. For instance, if you don't do this regularly, it's not your thing, as it were, attend a poetry reading, go to an art gallery, attend local theatre. Try and test your limits a little bit here. If you like Mozart, listen to death metal. If you like death metal, listen to Chopin. In other words, stretch your experience a little bit. Listen or do or watch or participate in something that's, for you, unfamiliar. Amongst the mystical, we have pray the Psalms daily for at least 1 week. Another spiritual practice that might take quite a bit of time is read the entire Bible over a period of, say, 3 months. I assure you it can be done. Read one of the Gospels through each week. Finally, there's that slightly strangely titled category, the world of which we are. And to give you some examples, we have conduct a carbon audit and make a concrete plan to reach a lower carbon lifestyle from the one that you are already living. Give up your car for a week, or perhaps a month if you can manage it. Do a digital detox, that is, go without your mobile phone and do not use email or the internet outside work for a week. That is, for many of us, quite scary. Then learn to identify what you're seeing when you look up at the sky at night. This, of course, assumes that you see anything other than light pollution and cloud, but if you're in an area where you have the privilege of being able to see the stars at night, learn to identify the constellations. And with all these practices, we've given you some links to help you along with what they demand. Find some slugs and or snails in their natural habitat and give them some time by watching them. These are strange forms of life. They seem very, very different from us, well, they are. But actually their life is quite interesting. And close observing of an animal that seems unlike a dog or a cat, quite distant and alien from us, leads to some interesting feelings and ideas. So those are the categories, and just a very small set of examples. You'll also notice as you go along that some of these practices have an asterisk next to them. One of your 4 practices should be one of these practices that has an asterisk. These are the practices that involve the conversation with science. Hobnobbing with slugs and snails is one of those asterisk practices. So if these are practices where some of that we learn in our spirituality science conversation, these practices will be relevant to that. Anyway, that's a rough outline of what we're asking you to do. In a nutshell, you look through this rather long list and choose 4 practices that are not already an established part of your Christian life. So if you're already doing something like this, don't choose that practice. Choose something that you've not done before, or perhaps not done for a very long time. As you go along with these practices, make some notes about your experience. Spend some time thinking about it and jot down your ideas, your feelings, what comes to you, what fires your imagination, what you might continue to do after the module is over, and why. I hope you find 4 exciting and satisfying practices. You should do, because there's a lot to choose from. But if you choose a practice that doesn't seem particularly fitting for you, if you choose a practice that actually drives you a bit nuts or makes you feel frustrated or makes you think, oh gosh, I can't do this, that's not a bad thing. You certainly haven't failed. Rather, you've actually learned something important about yourself and about your relationship with God. You can't pray in a way that you're not designed to do. You can't tackle something, or it's not wise to tackle something that is actually going to make you feel unsafe or be a burden on your mind and heart. So don't go about the exercise by thinking, what's going to be most painful for me? I must do that. Think what will push me a little, what will have me praying for the grace to do it. That's good. But don't, this is not an exercise in self-mortification. And certainly if you learn in one of these exercises about the ways in which you can't pray, practices that really do not suit you, that's something, as I say, that's a good thing. So, I wish you well. Practice away, and we in the class, during the sessions of this module, will continue to make some connections between what you're learning and the things you're doing.